Well, hello. I made all 5 of these table saw jigs that will help you with almost every operation on the table saw, all from this 1/2 sheet of plywood. Let me show you how to make them. I'll start out by breaking down a 4x4 sheet of Baltic birch plywood to the dimensions listed. Pay close attention to the cutting diagram and the project plans. Hi-ya! Yeah! Presto! That hurts. Ha! And now you can see the whole picture. 5 jigs out of one 4x4 by 3/4 piece of Baltic birch ply. First up is a saddle fence. The high side of this jig supports tall pieces when cutting them on edge. Flip it around to use it as a sacrificial fence for cutting rabbits. Let me show you how it's made. On the riser, I'm going to measure in 6 inches from either side, and I'll do the same for the high fence on each end. And the height is set at 1 3/4 inches, and I'll make those marks on each of those lines. This is a 3 drill bit operation, and the reason is I need a 1/4 inch hole for the 1/4 bolt inside this T-nut. I need a 5/16 inch bit for the clearance in the back, which will be about 1/2 inch. And lastly, I need a 3/4 inch Forstner bit, set about 1/8 inch deep, so that the face of that T-nut sits flush with the wood. I have set the fence to establish this distance so that all 3 bits can work off the same fence setting. And lastly, to make setup a little bit quicker, I've added index marks with tape on the back. I've used 2 pieces of scrap to protect the wooden jaws of my vise. To create the knobs, I cut 2 1¼ inch long sections of threaded rod. I've screwed on a chase nut so that at the end of the cut I can use that to clean up the threads. Added epoxy to one end and threaded it into the knob. Finally, I filled the void in the knob with the remaining epoxy. To assemble this saddle sled, I'm going to start by putting T-nuts in the 4 pre-drilled holes. I'm placing the high fence on the right side of my table saw fence, and on the left side of the table saw fence I'll place the riser. Clamping those in place allows me to set the bridge, and with that in place I can mark my index line. I removed the clamps, and using the index line I've pre-drilled holes for permanent attachment. I clamped the high fence and the riser back in place, and now place glue on the top edge of the riser and the back edge of the bridge. Now I've drilled 4 counterbore holes to attach the bridge to the riser with screws. Now, using my pre-drilled holes as a guide, I attach the high fence to the bridge. And lastly, I used a wet rag to remove glue from the top and the inside edges of the saddle fence. The saddle fence makes cutting bevels really easy, and here's how it's done. First, place the jig over the table saw fence with the high side facing the blade. Now insert both forearm knobs and tighten to ensure a tight fit. So raise and bevel your blade. In this case, I've set it to 15 degrees. Now take your stock, place it up against the high side of the fence, using the fence as a steady rest, and also using a push block, make the cut. Now look how nicely that edge turned out. No burn marks, no saw marks. Perfect. The saddle fence also works well as a sacrificial fence, and it's easy to use. First, drop the saddle fence over the table saw fence with the high side facing away from the table saw blade. Now raise the dado blade to 3/8 inch and slide the fence to expose 3/8 inch of that dado blade. Now turn on the saw and, using the jig as a guide, pass your board over the blade. The result is a perfect 3/8 by 3/8 inch rabbet. Next up is a tenon jig. This jig slides along the rip fence to carry the upright workpiece past the blade. Perfect for forming tenons on the ends of pieces. Let me show you how to build it. I'll measure down 2 inches and 6 inches on the high fence, and also the same 2 inches and 6 inches on the backing fence. And then finally, put cross marks at 5/8 inch from the left edge. I've used glue to attach the 2 2x12 inch backing pieces and then set them aside to dry. Now I've added 2 T-nuts to the high fence. I took the high fence and sat it on the opposite side of the table saw fence from the blade. Secondly, I put the riser on the inside edge closer to the blade and clamped those together. Lastly, I set the bridge on top of the riser and marked the high fence with an index line. So now, using the index line as a guide, I drilled 2 pilot holes. I added glue to the top of the riser and the back side of the bridge. I drilled 2 screws to attach the bridge to the riser, and finally 2 more screws through the back of the high fence into the bridge. To locate the holes for the backing fence, I set it up and clamped it behind the high fence and used a 13/64 bit through the T-nuts to show the marks for drilling. Then I took the backing fence to the drill press and drilled 2 9/32 slightly oversized holes through those previous marks. Finally, to finish the assembly, I used 2 1/4-20, 1.5 inch long round head bolts to attach the backing fence to the high fence. So this is a tenoning jig all assembled, and it does a great job of cutting the cheeks on a tenon. I've set up the fence and the table saw to cut a 1-inch high tenon. The stock is clamped to the fence, and the jig slides along the fence to create the cut. Once that cut's made, I reverse the piece and do it again. That gives me a perfect tenon every time. It's a good idea to make more of these backing fences with some of the scrap left over from your plywood sheet, because it's going to get chewed up, and that's why we use 2 bolts to hold it together and not glue. The next jig is a crosscut sled. Use it to steady wide panels or long pieces for perfect 90-degree crosscuts. Here's how to build it. We start by drilling a hole all the way through the edge of the sled's fence on the drill press. We'll set a block so the hole is centered and 1.5 inches away from one edge. Using a 1/4 inch drill bit, drill a through hole, making sure to relieve some of the sawdust as you drill to keep the bit from binding. Now that the hole has been drilled, time to take that piece to the table saw and rip a 3/4 inch long piece down the length of the fence. Now, coming back to the drill press, we have to make 2 more holes to accommodate the T-nut. I'm using a bench-mounted table vise to hold that piece while I tap in the T-nut to prevent splitting. And finally, it's time to glue those pieces back together again. As long as the glue is out, we can glue up 2 sets of the 2x2 inch blocks and 1 set of the 2x4 inch blocks. These will become sled stops and a blade guard for the sled. I'll make 2 knobs the same way as earlier, one with a 2.5 inch long rod, the other 3¼ inch long. I'll take our 2x3 inch block and drill a 1/4 inch hole centered 7/8 of an inch from the end. Then another 1/4 inch hole all the way through the edge, centered 1/2 inch from the end. I'll add holes for a T-nut here as well. To cut the 1/8 inch kerf in the stop block, I used double stick tape and attached that block to a sacrificial board and cut it on the table saw. Finally, I installed a T-nut using the vise jaws to keep it from splitting. The fence needs to have a centered groove, 1/4 inch wide and 1/4 inch high, to hold the rod. To do that, I've set the table saw fence up to cut right down the middle of that piece and then turn it around to cut it again. That center is my first cut. Now, moving the fence closer to the blade and making successive passes on both ends will widen that to a final 1/4. I've jointed and planed the board to fit exactly in my miter slot. The runner for this sled needs to be 3/8 of an inch thick. So I'll take that same board, lay it up against the fence and make 1 cut. Now, moving the fence 1/2 inch to the left, make another cut, and the off-fall piece will be 3/8 of an inch. It's now time to glue the fence to the base. I've applied glue to each side of the groove, pressed the rod in the center, and set that fence up against the base, making sure that the edges of the fence and the base are perfectly even, and then clamped. Now take a damp rag and remove excess glue, and use the rod sliding in and out of the hole to remove any excess glue in the groove. To place the runner, I've added 2 washers to both the front and the back to raise its level even with the face of the table. With the use of double stick tape and the fence slid to within 3 inches of the blade, I've carefully placed the sled even with the back of the saw and down onto that double-faced tape, pressing firmly to adhere the tape. Then I lift the entire sled unit off and use 3 screws to permanently attach the runner to the base. Now slide the fence to the right and raise the saw blade to about 3/4 of an inch, which is just above the thickness of the base. Turn the saw on and run the sled until that saw blade just touches the back fence. Then shut off the saw and leave the sled in that position. Lastly, mark its position with a pencil. Now take the sled stop, position it up against the back edge of the sled, and with a pencil, mark its location on the wing. I've drilled a counterbore hole in the center of that wing stop. So I set the wing stop up against the pencil line and use a punch to mark the center. So I used a smaller bit to start and finished with a 5/16 inch bit for the bolt hole. Now attach the block to the wing. Finally, glue the sled stop to the sled, positioned next to the wing stop. Now glue the blade guard to the back of the sled. Now insert the rod and tighten it with the forearm knob. Lastly, attach the stop block with the forearm knob. Now invert the sled and use 2 screws to further support the short arm of the sled. So to make 2 exact pieces, I will cut my first one to size. As soon as that cut's done, to assure the second one will be exactly the same, I can take the adjustable rod, slide it up until it reaches the end of that first cut, like so. And then when my second piece goes on, it touches that same stop block and allows me to make the second cut perfectly. The ripping sled lets you straight line rip rough cut lumber or put a precise taper on a workpiece. Here's how to make it. I've installed a 1/4 inch dado blade to cross cut 2 grooves on either end of the sled 7 inches in, and I set my fence at 7 1/8 inches to account for the thickness of the blade. The pre-cut groove provides clearance for the keyhole bit to complete the T-slot. I've set the router bit height to 3/8 of an inch out of the table and the fence 7 inches from the center of that bit. Lastly, I used a 1/4-20 hex head bolt to test that fit. I've gathered up 6 of the 2x2 squares and 2 of the 2x4 squares. I've glued up 2 blocks that now form 1.5 inches by 2 by 2. While the glue is drying, I'll lay out the center line and then take that block to the drill press. Drill a centered 1/4 inch hole through the face of each square and a corresponding hole through the 2 4-inch plywood blocks. Installing a stop block allows me to drill all of these in a single position. Two more knobs, both with 3.5 inch threaded rods. To use this ripping jig, I want to set it up against the fence, and I want to slide the fence over until the jig is just clear of the table saw blade, like this, because I don't want to cut that jig at all. Now I'll lower the blade. I'll take our 2 1/4-20 hex head bolts and assemble the hold downs. So these are 2-inch blocks. If I need more space, they're extra 3/4 inch blocks. There's the top of each hold down. I'll top these off with a washer and a forearm knob. And lastly, these are the wood hold downs. And I'm not just going to do anything other than get them in there. I'm not going to firm them down right at the moment. Now the purpose of this jig is to find one straight edge on this somewhat irregular board. So by using the jig and setting this up so that the edge that I want removed rides right up on the underside of the jig that's up against the blade. So what I'm going to do is set that. I can feel that difference. And first set the stop blocks. like so. And then finally the hold downs. Now if you're concerned about scratching the wood at all, you can just use a couple of scraps like this. I'm just going to slide it back and raise the table saw blade, and keeping the jig up against the fence, move this forward. The raised blade will cut a perfect, beautiful, straight edge down this and eliminate this tear out. And now we have a beautifully jointed edge. And to make the board parallel, this now goes up against the fence, and we make a second cut to give you the decided width. Now this sled can also be used as a taper jig, and here's how that works. First thing you'll notice is the piece that I want to taper doesn't fit underneath those hold downs. So all I want to do is take this knob off, and I'm going to insert a 3/4 inch block and put the knob back on. And I'll do the same thing in the back. That will give me the initial height that I need. And now what I want to do is I want to cut a 1/4 inch taper from this edge down to 0 at this edge. So I just put a pencil mark at 1/4 inch. And to do this, and again, because the jig slides right up against the table saw blade, I'm just going to extend my piece till it matches that line. And again, slide your stop blocks in, and this edge will be at 0. And lastly, and remember again, I can use these little pieces of scrap in there if I'm concerned about marking this up. And again, we'll raise the blade, keep the jig up against the fence. The table saw blade will trim this taper off of there down to just 0 at the end. And there's my taper, a 1/4 inch off from that edge, down to 0 at this one. If I want to do the opposite side, I could do the same thing. And remember, if I decide I want to stand this up to make a 4-sided one, I'll have to take the amount I cut off and put it back on the bottom to keep it level. It's a great way to make tapers. This jig does it beautifully. Finally, the Dado and Cutoff jig is a simple little gauge that lets you cut precise, repeatable dados without a dado blade. It can also be used for safe, repeatable shortcuts. Here's how I made it. To construct the Dado Cutoff jig, I've started with the last 2 pieces of 2 inch by 3 inch stock. I pre-cut a 1 inch by 1 inch section out of one of those 2 by 3 blocks, and that cut can be made on a table saw, bandsaw, or scroll saw. I then measured for a hole to be centered on the width and length of that small cutout. Now I'm drilling a 3/32 hole centered on that mark. Now I'm applying glue to one edge of the uncut block and joining them together to form a jig. And finally, to complete the jig, I've inserted an 8 by 1.25 inch long screw. So this is our completed Dado and Cutoff jig. And you can actually make a dado without using a dado blade. Here's how you use it. To cut a dado in this section of oak, I first mark the outside shoulder of the dado with a pencil mark. And I want to put the dado on the X side of that pencil mark. And now, using a standard 1/8 inch blade and selecting the tooth that's leaning to the right, I'll make sure that that tooth is lined up perfectly with a line on my board. Now, holding that board up against the face of the miter gauge, I'll slide the fence over until the jig's finger just touches the end of that board. Now, clamp the jig in place. Turn on the table saw and make your first pass. With the screw head set 3/8 of an inch beyond the finger, I can now slide that board back until the edge of the board touches the screw head. That 3/8 offset, combined with the thickness of the blade, will create a 1/2 inch dado. And lastly, use the blade to remove the waste between the 2 cuts. The result is a perfect 1/2 inch dado without using a dado blade. This jig can also make identical same length cutoff pieces. Here's how you do that. I've marked my stock for 3 inch cuts, and I've clamped the jig to the fence. Now sliding the board up and making individual cuts provides identical lengths. This is one of the few times when you can use a miter gauge and a fence in the same operation. The jig works perfectly. All those little blocks are cut nicely and none of them will contact the fence. A great way to make small, identical length cutoffs. So there you go, 5 jigs with 1/2 sheet of plywood. Now it's time to get back in your shop and make something.